A very good evening to all of you. My compliments to Mr. Suresh. He first opens the bar and then calls me to talk about it. A civil servant of all the persons. But compliments to you nonetheless for having the courage to call a former civil servant to speak to CEOs of various companies. It takes a lot of courage to do that. But this is my first ever experience where I've had to compete with the bar. So pardon me. What I'm going to talk about today is why things don't happen in the government with a view to explaining to you how can they be made to happen. It's very important. Because if you want to find a solution to a problem, you have to understand why it has happened in the first place. Now let me tell you, with my experience of 38 years as a civil servant, as I try to analyze as to why things don't happen in the government, and having understood that, I try to make few things happen, and I'll share that with you. You know, in this country, it's very easy to have an idea. You know, talk about COVID, go down the street and ask somebody, yaar, kuch karna chahiye, wo bata dega ek lambi list, kya karna chahiye. Everyone has a prescription. But the problem is that for any idea to fructify and sustain in a democracy like ours, it has to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, judicially tenable, and emotionally relatable. And above all, I'll explain this to you. And above all, for a civil servant like me, मुख्तसर सी जिंदगी का जब से अफसाने हैं, यहाँ तीर भी चलाने, परिंदे भी बचाने. How do you make things happen when situation is this? So let me explain this to you. Can you think of an idea to sustain and to fructify and sustain if it is not politically acceptable in a democracy? I can't think of an idea. If the boss does not agree with whatever ideas throw up or whatever suggestion that you give, it's gone. But this is not to say it still can't happen. The trick is how to sell this idea to a politician, which I did as a civil servant, to make him believe that it is also politically acceptable to him. And I'll come later with specific examples of how it can actually be done. As a civil servant, you know, we are in a habit of blaming everything on the politician and how wrong we are. You know, I saw politicians of all shapes, sizes, and colors. Having worked closely with Mr. Modi, I was secretary to Mr. Kalyan Singh. Incidentally, on this day, 6 December, 30 years ago, I was the only person with Mr. Kalyan Singh when Babri Masjid came down. Time permitting, I'll narrate that later on. So I had the occasion with working close to Dr. Manmohan Singh. So I saw all of them. Outstanding people. They're as good, as bad, as ugly as you and I. But we keep blaming them. The trick is to understand the politician, and that's what I tell my honest colleagues who are honesty full stop. I keep telling them, your job is not pure honesty. Honesty is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition to deliver things. You have to deliver things on the ground, and honesty is a given, and you can still do it. So whatever you suggest has to be politically acceptable. It has to be socially desirable. Look at what happened to the family planning policy way back in the 70s. It bombed because it was politically acceptable but not socially desirable. Similarly, it has to be technologically feasible. You may have a brilliant idea, but if the technology doesn't exist at that point in time, it may come later on, it won't work. As Secretary of School Education, you know, let me give you a bit of a background. I was first posted as Coal Secretary Government of India, and I didn't know much about the sector. So I rang up a friend of mine. I asked him, "Yaar, coal sector kaisa hai?" Usne kaha, "Gangs of Wasipur dekhi hai kya?" Answered. Sometimes questions answer your questions. So I tried to do whatever I could. By God's grace and on account of an absolutely amazing team that we had, we sorted the coal mess. In fact, I had a round table in my room, and there was so much positive energy in that room that on occasions, we used to jokingly say that give us the Kashmir problem, we just might be able to find a solution to it. And as luck would have it, two of my joint secretaries, one of them is presently Home Secretary, Government of India, the other is Additional Chief Secretary, Jammu and Kashmir. They're sorting the Kashmir problem. So I keep telling my colleagues, it's a question of attitude. Problems may not be of your making, sometimes of your making, or your colleague's making, or somebody's making. But if you have that attitude, you can find a solution to the problem. Then I got posted to school education. And I used to wonder, what have I to do with school education? And then I discovered that probably the government was looking for the most uneducated, illiterate civil servant to head the education ministry. And there I was. I thought that I was moving out of the dark dungeons of coal mines to the bright lights of school education. And to my utmost horror, I found the situation in the education sector was much worse than in the coal sector. You know, in the coal sector, all the mining was underground and the mafias were overground. In the education, it was the other way around. All the mafias underground, eating into the essentials of Indian society. It was in that context that there were so many advisors who came and told me, they took pity on me, this guy doesn't know anything. So we call them Rai Sahabs in UP, you know. They only give Rai advice. They wouldn't have done anything in their lives, but they are very good at giving. And there are some very costly ones across the Atlantic. They come here once in a while to tell you what you should do, and then they go away. Because it's so hot and humid in India, that they go back to their coal climes and keep pontificating from there. So one of those guys who came to me, he said, sir, you know, we were having problems with school teachers, shortage of school teachers and all. So first he tells me, sir, you must go to England, Finland, Holland, Scotland, this land, that land, every land. And before he could end this, I asked him, have you visited the motherland? He didn't realize it. And then he said, sir, you have a teacher's problem, sir, you do one thing. Sir, you webcast it centrally and let it be received in all the schools. You don't need teachers. So I said, are you aware that a large part of this country is not internet connected? Even in Delhi, sometimes the internet goes away. Oh, is that so? So it's not that internet will not get connected. We won't get internet. The question is, idea has to be technologically feasible at that point in time. Then, of course, it has to be financially viable. Jeb mein nahi patta, chal diye Kolkata. Now, how can you come up with an idea? You don't have the money. But you know, I have always said that if you have a great idea, then money will follow it. You should have the capability to market that idea, and it applies to all of you also. When you go to the government, you should be able to tell the government, okay, you may not have money at this point in time, but this is the flow that will come to you. It gels, it sells. The tragedy is that we in the government thought that sab businessman chor hai. And everyone in the businessmen thought that every bureaucrat is corrupt. Both were equally wrong. I discovered through my career that there are outstanding people both in the public and the private domain. All the rascals and ruffians of both public and private come together and make life difficult for us, but unfortunately the good people don't come together. So what I worked on in 38 years to get the public and private together. And it worked. It worked miracles. Some of them are outlined in my book. Because my contention is very clear. Efficiencies will come from the private domain and scale will come from the government domain. And the two should come together to make things happen. They can be made to happen. Much of the credit that I get for doing whatever I did during my career goes to this combination. I used to call myself a principal facilitator, not government, Secretary Government of India. People used to ask me, how are you able to leave office at 6 o'clock? At Secretary Government of India for 4 years, probably one of the longest service secretaries, I used to leave office at 6 o'clock and people didn't believe it. I said, I always thought they are better people than me. They should do the work. Why should I do the work? I only create an environment where they can work. And then they work. They are happy, I'm happy, everyone is happy. So it has to be financially viable. Then it has to be administratively doable. I say that because you may have a great idea which is politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, you have the money also, financially viable. But if you don't have the human resource, how do you make it happen on the ground? You have to get that. Now, I'm mentioning all these dimensions not to tell you that it can't be made to happen. I'm saying that you must recognize the terrain in which you're working. And once you recognize this terrain, you'll be able to sail through it. So you have to have the human resource. Then, of course, judicially attainable. I mean, this is one sector which I couldn't do anything. You know, this is an amazing sector. You know, when I wrote a book on ethical dilemmas of a civil servant, and I go around the country talking about ethics, and someone asked me this question, sir, then how did Gogoi get away with what he did? I have no answer for that. And then he asked me second question, sir, how can there be a compromise in sexual harassment? How can there be a compromise for a compromise? You know, either the lady was wrong or the judge was wrong. There can't be a compromise, but there was a compromise. So, frankly speaking, I told him, yeah, I can get away with not answering all your questions. I don't know the answer to that question. But the fact of the matter is, that guy got away with it. But I tell him that it's an exception. I still believe ethical conduct pays. My entire book is all about that. And let me digress a bit and explain this to you, why I wrote that book, Ethical Dilemmas of the Civil Servant. I used to go to the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration regularly, and I used to interact with officers of all seniorities. And I found that youngsters, when they joined, they had a lot of enthusiasm, they wanted to do things. But as they went up the ladder, they started blaming others, politicians, circumstances. And I told them, look at the officers who've been ethical in their conduct and have done very well. But the tragedy is, we don't discuss ethical officers who've done well in life and done well. We only discuss the negative part. Ye jail mein chala gaya, uske yahan itna pakda gaya. Why? Because we are fond of masala, no? We discuss only that. And that's why post-retirement, I started this movement called Nexus of Good. The idea is to demonstrate to the naysayers that good can happen because good is happening. We are not looking at it. How about looking at that good, analyzing it, understanding it, replicating it, and scaling it, so that good people can come together? As I said earlier, if all the rascals and ruffians of the world could come together, why shouldn't good come together? And that's what Nexus of Good is all about. I'm mentioning this here because if you find an opportunity, go to this portal, you'll find hundreds of stories where wonderful work is being done, not being discussed. I think we should discuss it. So coming back to that, the 6 items that I had mentioned, judicial tenability, then finally, it is also emotional relatability. Now, this dimension was added when Farms Bill happened. Actually, my book talks about only 6 dimensions. The 7th was added because here was a bill which was actually useful to the farmers. But it didn't go through because probably we couldn't market it well enough for the audience or the stakeholders to appreciate the fact that it was useful to them. And hence it didn't go. And then, of course, you have these 5 C's which are inhibiting factors, the CBI, the CBI, and of course another E is added, but anyway, CBI, CAG, CVC, CIC, and courts. It's very difficult. But having said that, my contention is it can be made to happen. Because if you look around, there are a number of civil servants. I interacted with a lot of industry. As head of the project monitoring group, I remember we were fast-tracking projects all above 1,000 crore, each of them. At a time when scams were breaking out, it was 2013, when I was summoned from Cambodia. I had gone there to attend a conference and asked to head this project monitoring group. I distinctly remember when I went to the cabinet secretary, no one had a clue. They said, we have picked you up to fast-track projects. At a time when decision-making was virtually impossible. Every civil servant was not taking a decision. I was asked to head. And as soon as I walked out of the cabinet secretary's room, I got a call from the chairman of a public sector bank. Boss, he was a class fellow of mine. Boss, Chidambaram is announcing you as head of a project monitoring group. I said, wo marenge, mujhe marwayenge. But how do I get out of it? I use technology to the hilt. And I'm now switching over to aspects which probably may interest you. We digitized everything. So if an industry had a problem, they could go to that portal and write their problem on the portal. That problem would automatically flow to the related joint secretary of the ministry. He was mandated to comment on that. Then I used to have tripartite discussion. And all I said was, Bhaiya, take a decision. Don't sit on a file. It worked. I'm cutting a long story short. It worked. In 15 months of UPA government, UPA 2 government, scams were breaking out, we got clearance worth 5 lakh crores worth of project. People ask me, how did you get it? How did you manage it? I said, simple. It's very simple. No matter how inefficient I am, to the public, I'd like to appear to be efficient. So if the world knows that I'm sitting on a file for so many hours, so many seconds, so many days, then I'll put that file. Believe me, one cabinet minister lost her job because she was sitting on files worth more than 53,000 crores. She lost her job. It hit the headlines. And I'm telling you the background, details are there in my book. Now, why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this is, when you approach the government, my suggestion to all of you is, don't approach individually. Move through an organization, FICCI, whichever organization you have, move through organization, so that you remain in the background. Because I've seen it from very close quarters. Some governments can be very vindictive. Whereas you have all good intentions, but sometimes it is misunderstood. So move. Second, you push the government into making the processes transparent. Why? Because it doesn't require a single penny. It doesn't require money. Making things transparent is not that difficult. I did it. In coal ministry and education ministry, we didn't have a file of paper. I distinctly remember one day Mr. Kumar Mangala Birla came to meet me, and he didn't see any file on my table. He said, sir, how is it that you don't have any file on the table? I said, we have digitized everything. What do you mean? Everything digital, for a variety of reasons, but more to save my back. Because if everything is transparent, MLF ID cannot be attributed to me. And then things will pace up. Then he turned toward his two CEOs and said, why can't we do it in our offices? I said, you won't be able to do it. He said, why? I said, I can afford to be transparent, you can't afford to be transparent. But the government should become transparent. That is what you should push. Why? Because, you ask for tax concessions. Government is hard pressed for money. Every government is. But for you, time is money. So if your sanctions, clearances happen on time, you save that money. You won't save that so much on taxes as on this. I saw it with my own eyes. I did it and I saw it. What we did in coal block auctions, we auctioned coal blocks worth 1.76 lakh crores, not a finger pointed. Why? Because everything was transparent. It's not that I didn't commit mistakes. I did. I committed a number of mistakes. But since every decision was put on the portal, within an hour I used to get a call, sir, ये आपने क्या कर दिया? तुमने क्या कर दिया? खोलो भाई फाइल देखो, हमारे पे गड़बड़ हुई. अगले दिन सुबह प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस की, before the journalist gets to know what wrong I have done, I used to announce मेरे से गलती हो गई. और ठीक कर दिया. So my suggestion to you, one is push for transparency in processes, push for using technology in processes, and I'm working with an organization in Haryana in a slightly different context. They are planning to digitize all the processes where a common man interfaces with the government. They have identified about 500 such processes. They've already digitized 300 processes where the common man doesn't have to go to any government office. All the corruption delays are because of the physical interface. You eliminate physical interface, which can be done now because of technology, and it will be removed. So that is one. Second, when I was Export Commissioner, Government of India, way back in 97, 98, all the leading exporter organizations used to come to me and come up with a beautiful document, 100-page document. Same document was given to the minister, to the secretary, to the export commissioner, to the undersecretary, perhaps even to Chaprasi. Same. So I used to tell him, भाई आप अपना product जब market करते हैं तो consumer को देखते हैं ना कि वो कितना पढ़ता है, लिखता है, देखेगा नहीं देखेगा. अरे भाई क्यों देते हैं आप ये पोथा सबको? Because ultimately they will end up in the table of undersecretary. No one will read it. So as you examine your consumer while producing a product, you must examine the person that you are talking to and give him only that much, so that he has that much time. And most importantly, as I started with, don't treat every civil servant similarly. I can tell you, and I've had enough experience in the government and now outside the government, there are good people around. There are very well-meaning people around. Don't go with a prejudice or a bias to meet a civil servant. Do some research and find out who amongst them listens, who amongst them works. That is a research that you should do. You can do actually. And then you will be able to reach out to the right person and will be able to talk. See, the tragedy is that we are so prejudiced against each other that we feel that bina paise diye kaam nahi chalega, which is absolutely absurd, I see. I mean, I know of so many people who do without it and take pleasure in doing it. Take pleasure. I'm sure some of you would have had that experience also. The tragedy is we don't talk sufficiently about those good people. How about हम मुक्त कंठ से जब बुराई करते हैं तो मुक्त कंठ से तारीफ क्यों नहीं करते? Why can't we praise good work, whether it's a civil servant or otherwise? Because what does a civil servant get? Someone asked me, I was doing this scheme called Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, a health insurance scheme, arguably the biggest health insurance scheme, now morphed into Ayushman Bharat. And I was doing this scheme. Suddenly this scheme came to be recognized world over as one of the finest schemes in the world. So when Obama took over as the president of the US, his advisor rang me up. He said, Mr. Swarup, can you come over to Washington and give us a brief presentation on health insurance because we are struggling with it. So I tried to wriggle out. I said, our context is different. What will I do? He insisted. So in one of my visits to World Bank, I went over to Brookings Institute, which houses these advisors, and I make this presentation on RSPY. And they were, government representatives. They were also from our own mission. Then there were representatives of Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, many foundations. So after the presentation like this, of course, they didn't have a bar. We had a cup of coffee, went out. And over a cup of coffee, this gentleman from Gates Foundation walks up to me and asks me, Mr. Swarup, you are a civil servant, but you seem to be very passionate about the scheme. What is the government giving you beyond your salary? So I asked him a counter question. Gates Foundation gives millions of dollars to poor countries. What do you get out of it? He said, well, that's a job, but more than that, we derive a lot of satisfaction helping the poor. I said, you answered your own question. This scheme is meant for the poorest of the poor. Those that survived into the scheme and their families, their good wishes come back to me somehow, anyhow. That's good enough a kick for me to do what I'm doing. And then I narrated an incident to him, illustrate what I meant. In this scheme, we had these smaller hospitals, not Maxes and Apollos, that were empaneled. So in one of the visits, I used to visit these hospitals a lot. I was talking to a beneficiary patient. Suddenly, I heard a very feeble voice from behind. I turned around and saw a very old lady. She couldn't sit. She was calling me, Beta, idhar aao. So I turned around, went to her. Since she couldn't sit, I bent down. Mata ji, aap theek to hain? She tells me, Beta, main bahut takleef mein hu, lekin in hospital walon ne mera khayal rakha. Then I said, Mata ji, phir to aap theek ho jayengi. नहीं बेटा मेरी तो उम्र हो गई है मैं ऊपर वाले के पास जाऊंगा आई सेड नहीं आप ठीक हो जाएंगे नहीं बेटा मेरा कोई नहीं है इस दुनिया में ना भाई है ना बेटा मैं तो भीख मांगती थी मैं बीमार पड़ गई मेरा पड़ोसी था वो भी भीख मांगता था उसने तुम्हारा एक कार्ड देखा दिस वाज स्मार्ट कार्ड बेस्ड इंश्योरेंस स्कीम ये कार्ड देखा मुझे यहाँ ले आया ये अस्पताल वाले मेरी सेवा कर रहे हैं मुझसे पैसे भी नहीं मांगते मेरे पास है भी नहीं देने को आई टोल्ड नहीं माता जी आपको पैसे देने की जरूरत नहीं होगी आप जाएंगी घर जाएंगी दिस कैरिड ऑन फॉर अ वाइल एंड देन शी टेल्स मी नहीं बेटा मेरी उम्र इतनी हो अब मैं ऊपर वाले के पास जाऊंगा और ऊपर वाले जाके एक बात जरूर कहूंगी तुम्हारी स्कीम बहुत अच्छी है I call them as my Bharat Ratnas, and I have many such Bharat Ratnas in my service career. That keeps me going. It gives me goosebumps as I narrate this to you. So I keep telling my colleagues, यार सोच लो क्या करना है. Your true worth will be determined after you retire. पहले तो सब जी हुजूरी करेंगे, अरे साहब आपसे अच्छा अधिकारी ना आया है ना आएगा. रिटायरमेंट के बाद मालूम करो तो असलियत मालूम पड़ेगी. I am discovering that. I am earning out of what I did during my service. I couldn't earn much as a civil servant, but I am glad that I am earning so much. I am extremely thankful to Mr. Suresh to have given me this opportunity to come and interact with all of you. There are a lot many stories to tell, but I think you would rather go to the bar than listen to me. Thank you very much. Thank you. बंद कर देता हूं.